The morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the quiet streets. A woman sat behind the wheel of her car, adjusting her rearview mirror and taking a deep breath. Today was not an ordinary day for her. It was the first day of a new chapter, one she had worked years to reach. She was about to step into her role as the new administrator at the local police department, a position that carried both responsibility and pride. She had prepared carefully for this moment. Her dark blue suit was neatly pressed, her shoes polished, and her briefcase packed with all the documents she might need. In that briefcase lay her appointment letter, the official recognition of her hard-earned position. She had envisioned walking into the building with confidence, greeting officers and staff, and beginning her work with a sense of excitement. But as she turned onto a main road, her vision of the morning began to shift. In her rearview mirror, she noticed flashing blue and red lights. At first, she thought the patrol car was rushing to an emergency, and she instinctively slowed down to pull to the side, giving way. But then, the sound of the siren cut sharply through the morning calm, and she realized the lights were not meant for someone else. They were meant for her. Her heart thudded in her chest. She had done nothing wrong. She was driving carefully, staying within the speed limit, obeying every traffic rule. She quickly glanced at the dashboard, making sure nothing was amiss. Her seatbelt was fastened, her signal lights had been used correctly. Still, the patrol car remained close behind, its lights demanding her to stop. She pulled her car over to the curb, rolled down her window slightly, and waited. The seconds stretched long as she saw two officers step out of their vehicle. Their posture was firm, their strides confident, almost heavy. She could feel her pulse quickening, though she forced herself to remain calm. This wasn't the kind of first encounter with the department she had expected. One officer approached her driver's side while the other lingered near the passenger side, watching closely. The officer who leaned down to her window didn't greet her with kindness or even neutrality. Instead, his voice carried an edge of suspicion as he asked for her license and registration. "Good morning, officer," she said softly, her tone respectful. She reached slowly toward her purse, pulling out her license, and then opened her glove compartment to retrieve her car's registration papers. She handed them over carefully, making sure her hands were visible at all times. The officer glanced at the documents, then looked at her with eyes that seemed to hold unspoken assumptions. He didn't smile, didn't offer any explanation for why she had been stopped. Instead, he asked where she was going, and why she was in such a rush. "I'm not in a rush," she replied calmly. "I'm on my way to the precinct." The officer raised his eyebrows slightly, his expression tightening as though he doubted her words. "The precinct? For what purpose?" Her lips curved into the faintest of smiles, though inside she felt a pang of disappointment. She had imagined being welcomed at the department, not questioned on the side of the road. Still, she answered politely, "I have an appointment there this morning." The second officer, who had been standing watch, stepped closer, adding his own questions. His tone was just as sharp, almost as if he were interrogating her instead of conducting a routine stop. "Appointment for what?" he asked. She paused for a moment, debating whether to reveal the truth. She wanted to walk into the building and introduce herself in the right setting, not explain herself in the middle of the street, but the officer's attitudes left her little choice. "I've recently been appointed as the new administrator," she said quietly. "Today is my first day." Her words hung in the air, but neither officer reacted the way she expected. Instead of showing respect or even curiosity, they exchanged a quick glance as though her claim was too unbelievable to be taken seriously. One of them even smirked faintly, as if the idea were absurd. She felt a wave of frustration rise within her chest, but she pressed it down. Losing her patience would serve no purpose. Instead, she kept her composure. "If you'd like," she added, "I can show you the official letter." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out the neatly folded document. The officer hesitated, then took it from her hand. His eyes scanned the paper quickly, moving from the department seal to her name, then back to her face. His expression flickered just briefly between surprise and discomfort. Still, he handed it back without apology, saying only, "We just needed to make sure everything was in order." She accepted the paper, placing it carefully back in her briefcase. "Of course," she said, her tone steady, though inside she felt the sting of their doubt. The officers walked back to their car, their steps slightly less certain than before. She sat in her own vehicle for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. The morning sun still shone bright, but the air around her felt heavier. This was not how she had imagined her first day would begin. Instead of feeling welcomed and respected, she had been treated with suspicion. The irony was bitter. Soon she would be stepping into a position of leadership over the very department that had just stopped her without reason. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of the bigger picture. This was exactly why she had accepted the role. Change did not come easily, and progress was often uncomfortable. If anything, this encounter only proved how much work there was to be done. Turning the key, she started her engine again and pulled back onto the road. Her destination was still the same, but her mindset had shifted. She no longer carried just excitement for her new position. She carried a stronger purpose, a determination to make a difference in a place where assumptions too often overshadowed respect. Her journey that morning, interrupted though it was, became the quiet beginning of something larger. She didn't yet know how the officers would react when they saw her walk into the precinct later that day, introduced as their new administrator. But she knew one thing clearly. She would not let their assumptions define her. She would let her work, her leadership, and her integrity speak louder than anything else. And with that thought, she drove on, her eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead, ready to step into the building that would soon hold the weight of her vision. The road stretched ahead as she continued driving toward the precinct, but the silence inside her car weighed heavily. The stop had lasted only a few minutes, but it had left her with a swirl of emotions. She had felt their eyes judging her, their tone sharp, their questions laced with doubt. It was not the first time she had experienced such treatment, but today it carried a heavier sting. Today was supposed to be about stepping into a respected role, not being reduced to suspicion before even walking through the precinct doors. She thought back to the look in the officers' eyes, how they had seemed so sure of their assumptions. They hadn't seen her polished suit, her briefcase, or even her calm manner as signs of professionalism. They had only seen what they wanted to see. The memory made her tighten her grip on the steering wheel, but she quickly loosened it again. She couldn't let her mind circle around anger. She needed to walk into that building with her head held high. As she pulled into the parking lot of the precinct, she noticed the same patrol car from earlier sliding into a spot across the lot. The two officers stepped out, their voices carrying faintly through the morning air as they spoke to each other. She didn't linger to listen. She straightened her jacket, picked up her briefcase, and began the walk toward the main entrance. Inside, the station was buzzing with activity. Phones rang. Officers walked briskly through the halls, and the murmur of conversations filled the air. She moved quietly toward the reception desk, offering a polite smile to the officer seated there. "Good morning," she said warmly. "I'm here for the administrator's office." The receptionist glanced up, eyes moving briefly over her before asking for her name. She provided it calmly, and the officer typed quickly into the computer, nodding after a moment. "Someone will take you upstairs," the officer said with a short smile. As she waited, she could feel a few passing glances land on her. Some were casual, some curious. She stood tall, refusing to let herself shrink under the weight of anyone's assumptions. Soon another officer appeared to escort her upstairs. He was polite enough, though his words were clipped, as if he hadn't yet decided what to think of her. Walking down the hallway, she passed several framed photographs of past administrators, all men, most older. Their stern faces looked down from the walls, reminders of the traditions and history she was stepping into. For a moment, she wondered how many people in this building had expected someone like her to take the role. She already knew the answer. Not many. When she entered the office space, a few staff members glanced up from their desks. Some offered polite nods, others simply looked and turned back to their work. She could sense the quiet curiosity in the air, the kind that lingered unspoken but heavy enough to notice. As she settled into her office, arranging her papers and setting down her briefcase, she replayed the morning in her head again. The stop by those two officers was more than just an inconvenience. It was a symbol of the kind of mindset she would be working to change. If they had treated her this way, What about the people in the community who didn't have an official letter in their bag or a professional title to prove their identity? The thought weighed on her. A knock on her door pulled her out of her reflection. One of the officers from earlier walked in, holding a file in his hand. Their eyes met, and for a moment the air between them grew tense. Recognition flashed across his face, and she saw the color drain slightly as he realized who she was. She smiled politely, though not warmly. "Good morning," she said, her voice even. The officer hesitated before responding, his tone softer now than it had been on the roadside. "Morning," he replied quickly, placing the file on her desk before excusing himself. She watched him leave, her thoughts swirling again. The sudden change in his tone, the way his confidence had faltered, it was clear he hadn't expected this. And though she had no intention of embarrassing him, she couldn't ignore the sharp contrast between how he had spoken to her earlier and how he had spoken now. Later in the day, she overheard small conversations in the hallway. People were whispering about the new administrator, piecing together bits of information. Some seemed surprised, some skeptical, others neutral. It was clear that her arrival had stirred curiosity and perhaps even discomfort among some of the staff. She took it all in silently, reminding herself that change never came without resistance. She hadn't taken this role to be liked instantly or to blend in easily. She had taken it to make a difference, to push for fairness, respect, and accountability. As the hours passed, she focused on her tasks, reviewing reports, familiarizing herself with ongoing projects and noting areas that needed attention. But beneath it all, the morning encounter with those officers still lingered in her mind. It wasn't about holding a grudge. It was about understanding the deeper issue it revealed. In the afternoon, she attended a meeting with several department heads. The room was filled with chatter until the moment she walked in. Silence fell briefly as eyes turned toward her, studying her, weighing her presence. She walked to the front with confidence, introduced herself, and spoke with steady authority. Her words were calm yet firm, outlining her vision for her role and the goals she hoped to achieve alongside them. Some nodded in agreement. Some stayed expressionless, and some exchanged glances with each other. She could feel the undercurrent of doubt in the room, but she didn't let it shake her. Every word she spoke came from conviction, not from the need for approval. When the meeting ended, she left the room with her head high, but inside she felt the heaviness of the journey ahead. She knew trust would not be given easily. She would have to prove herself not only through words but through consistent action. And while the morning's traffic stop had been unpleasant, it had only sharpened her resolve. That evening, as she packed up to leave, she passed the same two officers again in the hallway. This time they looked at her differently. Not with suspicion, not with dismissive glances, but with something closer to caution. Perhaps even respect, though they didn't say it out loud. She gave them a polite nod as she walked past. She had no need for confrontation. Time and her work would speak louder than any words could. Walking out into the cool air, she thought about how quickly assumptions could shape behavior, how quickly judgment could cloud fairness. The morning had reminded her of a truth she already knew. Respect should never be conditional. And so, with the sun beginning to set and the day behind her, she made a silent promise to herself. She would carry the weight of these experiences not as a burden, but as fuel. She would lead with dignity. She would demand fairness. And she would remind those around her, whether in uniform or not, that respect was the foundation of trust. Her first day had not gone the way she imagined, but in a way it had been the perfect start. It had revealed the very challenges she was stepping in to face, and though the road ahead would not be easy, she was ready for it. The day moved slowly, filled with small introductions and stacks of papers that needed her attention. She kept her focus sharp, but the morning encounter lingered in her thoughts. Every so often she caught herself remembering the way the officers had looked at her when she mentioned her position, the disbelief in their eyes, the smirk of doubt. It wasn't anger that stayed with her, but something else, a quiet determination to prove that her place here was not only earned but necessary. By mid-afternoon, she received a call asking her to meet with the precinct captain and a few senior officers in the main conference room. This would be her first formal introduction to the leadership team. She straightened her jacket, gathered her notes, and walked toward the room with steady steps. As she approached, she could hear faint voices inside, men speaking in low tones punctuated with occasional laughter. The sound stopped when she entered. A few eyes widened slightly, others narrowed with curiosity. She could almost feel the unspoken question hanging in the air. Is this really the new administrator? The captain stood, greeting her with a handshake that was polite but distant. "Welcome," he said, his voice formal. "We're glad you're here. Please have a seat." She sat at the large table, facing a row of officers whose expressions revealed more than their words ever could. Some looked at her as if measuring her worth, others with a guarded neutrality, and a few with quiet skepticism. She knew this atmosphere well, an environment where respect had to be earned twice over, where every word would be weighed. The meeting began with introductions, each officer stating their role and experience. When it came her turn, she spoke clearly. She explained her background, her responsibilities, and her vision for the department's future. Her words were calm but firm, each sentence crafted to show that she was not here by accident or favor, but by merit and purpose. When she finished, there was a brief silence, followed by a few polite nods. No applause, no warm welcome, just the cool weight of acknowledgement. She expected nothing more. It was not approval she sought, but progress. As the meeting continued, she noticed a shift at the edge of her vision. The door opened quietly and two officers slipped in late, taking seats near the back. She recognized them immediately. The very same officers who had stopped her that morning. Her chest tightened for a moment, but she kept her expression neutral. She continued listening, her eyes occasionally flicking toward them. They avoided looking directly at her, their focus fixed instead on their notes or the table in front of them. When the captain paused to allow her to speak about her immediate priorities, she stood. She held the room's attention with quiet authority as she spoke of fairness, efficiency, and the need for stronger relationships between officers and the community. Her words carried no anger, but they held a weight that made a few shift in their seats. "I believe," she said steadily, "that respect is the foundation of trust. Without it, everything else falls apart. Respect is not something we can choose to give only when it feels easy. It must guide every decision, every interaction, whether inside this building or out in the community." The room was still. Her voice was not raised, but it carried across every corner. She could feel the impact of her words landing, even on those who had doubted her most. For a brief moment, her eyes met with one of the officers from that morning. His face gave little away, but the shift in his posture told her enough. He knew, he remembered. And now, he realized. The captain nodded thoughtfully, thanking her for her remarks before moving on to other agenda points. The meeting carried on with discussions about schedules, budgets, and reports, but the air in the room felt different now. She had said what she needed to say, and though the silence of the officers did not reveal their thoughts, she sensed a quiet ripple beneath the surface. When the meeting ended, people rose from their chairs, gathering their files and exchanging quick words. She collected her notes calmly, waiting until the room had mostly emptied before walking toward the door. In the hallway, she heard footsteps behind her. One of the two officers from earlier caught up to her, his expression uneasy. He hesitated before speaking. "About this morning," he began, his voice quieter than it had been during the stop. She turned to face him, her expression composed. "Yes," he cleared his throat, searching for words. "I didn't realize. We didn't know." She held up a hand gently, stopping him. "You didn't need to know who I was," she said softly. "Respect shouldn't depend on someone's title." Her words seemed to settle heavily on him. He nodded slightly, his eyes dropping for a moment before he stepped back and excused himself. She watched him go, her heart calm but steady. She had no desire to humiliate him, but she wanted the truth to linger. Respect was not something that should be reserved for authority. It was something everyone deserved. That evening, as she sat in her office gathering her things, she thought back to the events of the day. The disbelief, the awkward recognition, the silence in the conference room, it all wove together into a lesson. Not just for the officers, but for her as well. Change would not come easily, but it would come. She knew that whispers would continue, that people would test her, that some would hope to see her stumble. But she also knew that her strength did not lie in proving herself to doubters. It lay in staying true to her purpose, in carrying herself with dignity, and in building trust step by step. When she finally left the precinct, the air outside was cool and the sky had darkened into shades of deep blue. She walked to her car slowly, her steps unhurried. As she drove away, the events of the day replayed in her mind. The stop in the morning had been uncomfortable. The meeting had been tense. The recognition had been awkward. But none of it shook her. Instead, it strengthened her resolve. She was not just filling an office. She was here to make an impact. And though the officers had doubted her at first glance, the truth was now clear to them. She was not only their new administrator, but also a reminder that assumptions could be shattered in a single moment of realization. With the lights of the city flickering in the distance, she drove home with quiet determination, ready to return the next day and continue the work she was meant to do. The next morning, she woke up with the same determination as the day before, though the weight of yesterday's events still rested on her shoulders. She moved through her routine calmly, ironing her suit, preparing her notes, and packing her bag. As she looked at her reflection in the mirror, she whispered a quiet reminder to herself. Walk in with grace. Lead with strength. When she arrived at the precinct, the atmosphere was a little different. People glanced at her with more awareness now. It wasn't the warm kind of recognition, but rather a careful acknowledgement. Some faces showed curiosity, some respect, and some an uncertain caution. It was clear that the story of who she was had already spread across the building. She walked into her office, placed her briefcase on the desk, and took a moment to steady herself. She knew today would bring new challenges. Leadership was not just about making decisions behind a desk, it was about being seen, about how she carried herself in every space, even in the hallways where whispers followed. Later in the morning, a meeting was called in the main hall. All staff were expected to attend. It was the official introduction of the new administrator to the entire department. The room was filled with officers in uniform, clerks, secretaries, and other staff. The chatter was loud at first, but it grew quiet as the leadership team walked in. She followed behind them, her posture tall, her steps measured. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, studying her carefully, trying to piece together who she was beyond the title. She moved toward the front, taking her place beside the captain. The captain spoke first, his voice echoing across the room. Today we welcome our new administrator. She will be working closely with all of us to improve our systems, strengthen our communication, and ensure that this department continues to serve the community with efficiency and respect. There was polite applause, but it was brief, fading quickly. She stepped forward, her gaze steady as she scanned the room. And then she saw them, the two officers who had stopped her on the road. They stood among their colleagues, their faces stiff, their eyes trying not to meet hers. The moment was heavy with irony. The very people who had dismissed her without thought were now standing in the crowd, realizing she was the one who would oversee much of their work. She did not allow herself to pause. Instead, she smiled gently, placing her hands on the podium as she began to speak. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm but strong. "I am honored to stand here with you today. I know some of you may not know much about me yet, but I am here for one reason: to work with you, not against you. I believe that every person in this department matters, and every voice deserves to be heard." The room remained quiet. Some listened attentively, some with folded arms and others with unreadable expressions. She continued, speaking from her heart. "We are here to serve the community. That means the people outside these walls, and it also means the people within them. Respect, fairness, and accountability must guide us every day, not only when it is easy, but also when it challenges us." Her words were not long, but they were weighty. She didn't raise her voice or try to impress with complicated speeches. She simply spoke truth. And truth has a way of settling into silence. When she finished, there was another round of applause, a little stronger than before. She thanked them quietly and stepped back. As the gathering ended, staff began to leave the hall in groups, some talking among themselves, others glancing back at her. She remained at the front, speaking briefly with the captain, before making her way toward the exit. In the hallway, she crossed paths with the two officers again. They stiffened slightly, their eyes darting away as if unsure how to behave. She gave them a polite nod. No words, no coldness, just a gesture that acknowledged them. The awkwardness of their expressions said everything. They knew she remembered. They knew she hadn't forgotten the way they treated her on the roadside. But she wasn't here to hold grudges. She was here to lead. Later in the day, she walked through different departments, introducing herself to clerks, assistants, and junior officers. She shook hands, asked questions, and listened carefully. People began to see that she wasn't just a title behind a desk. She was present. She cared about the details, and she respected those who handled them. Some were surprised at her approachable manner. Others seemed cautious, as if waiting to see if this was just a first-day impression that would fade. She didn't mind their doubt. Trust could only be built with time. That afternoon, as she returned to her office, she found a small group of officers waiting outside with files that needed approval. Among them, once again, stood one of the officers from that morning's stop. This time, when their eyes met, his gaze didn't turn away. He handed her the file with both hands, his tone respectful. "Here's the report you asked for," he said. "Thank you," she replied simply, meeting his eyes with calmness. It was a small moment, but it carried meaning. The stiffness in his tone, the care in his manner, it was different now. Not perfect, but different. As the day went on, she noticed more of these small shifts. A secretary smiled a little warmer. An officer who had been distant in the morning greeted her in the hall. A clerk who seemed skeptical at first lingered to chat about paperwork. Change was not sweeping the building like a storm. It was happening quietly in gestures and glances, and she knew that was enough for now. Change rarely arrived loudly. It began in silence and subtle awareness. By evening, as the staff packed up and the building grew quieter, she sat alone in her office. She thought back to the first moment she was stopped on the road, how assumptions had shaped the officer's tone. And now, only a day later, those same officers had seen her in a new light. She didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel revenge. What she felt was clarity. Leadership was not about proving people wrong. It was about showing them a better way, even when they least expected it. She packed her bag slowly, turned off the light in her office, and walked out into the hallway. The building was almost empty, the echo of her footsteps following her toward the exit. When she reached the parking lot, the sky was painted with the soft colors of sunset. She stood for a moment, breathing in the cool air, reflecting on the weight of the day. This was only the beginning. There would be more moments like this, more doubt, more awkward recognition. But there would also be more opportunities to change minds, to set an example, to remind everyone inside the department and out that respect must always come before assumption. With that thought, she unlocked her car, placed her briefcase on the seat beside her, and started the engine. As she drove away, the lights of the precinct grew smaller in her rearview mirror. But her purpose grew stronger in her heart. The days turned into weeks, and slowly the new rhythm of her role began to take shape. At first there had been whispers, curious stares, and plenty of hesitation. But over time something shifted. It wasn't sudden, and it wasn't loud. It was in the way people began to greet her in the hallway, in the way officers approached her with questions, and in the way her presence no longer carried the same surprise it once did. Still, the memory of that first morning never left her. She remembered every detail, the flashing lights in her mirror, the sharp tone of the officers, the doubt in their eyes when she said where she was going. It replayed in her mind not as a wound, but as a reminder. That moment was the reason she carried herself with such quiet strength now. It was proof of how easily assumptions could cloud judgment, and how important it was to challenge them. She didn't share the story widely inside the precinct. She didn't need to. Those who needed to know already knew. The two officers from that morning carried the memory just as much as she did. She saw it in their eyes every time they passed her in the hallway, in the careful tone they used when speaking to her now. There was no malice in them anymore, just a quiet awareness that had changed the way they looked at her, and maybe the way they looked at others too. One afternoon, she was invited to speak at a small gathering within the department. The topic was building stronger trust between officers and the community. She stood before the group, her hands resting gently on the podium, her voice calm but steady. "We often think of trust as something that comes from the community toward us," she began, "but it begins with how we treat them. It begins with the respect we show even in the smallest moments. A traffic stop, a conversation on the street, a phone call answered at the desk. These are not small things to the people experiencing them. They shape how people see us. They shape whether people believe we are here to protect or to judge." Her eyes moved across the room, pausing for just a moment on the two officers who had stopped her. They sat listening intently, their expressions unreadable but their focus locked on her words. She didn't mention them, didn't bring up her own story, but her message carried the weight of her experience. Every person we meet deserves respect, no matter who they are, no matter what they look like, no matter what we think in the moment. Because respect is not earned by status. Respect is the foundation of trust, and without it, our work means nothing. The room was quiet. Some nodded slowly, others simply listened in silence. She didn't need applause. She only needed the words to linger. After the session ended, a few staff members approached her to thank her for what she said. Among them was one of the officers from that morning. He waited until others had walked away before speaking. "I heard you," he said quietly. She looked at him calmly. "I'm glad," she replied. He hesitated, then added, "I realize now, we didn't treat you the way we should have. And I've been thinking about how often we might do that without even noticing." She nodded, her voice soft but firm. "The important thing is what you do next. Reflection is only useful if it leads to change." He lowered his head slightly in agreement. "You're right. It wasn't a full apology, but it was something more valuable. It was acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was the first step toward growth." Weeks later, she began to see small signs of change in the way those officers handled their work. She heard them greeting people with a little more courtesy, saw them taking extra moments to explain things during routine stops, noticed the absence of the sharp tone they once carried so easily. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Her influence was spreading, not through force or demands, but through presence and example. She hadn't raised her voice or imposed authority to prove herself. Instead, she had led with dignity, and it was quietly reshaping the culture around her. There were still challenges, of course. Some resisted change, some doubted her vision, and some clung to old ways. But she didn't let those moments discourage her. She reminded herself of the long journey that had brought her here, of the strength it had taken to sit at the table where she once wasn't expected to sit. One evening, long after most of the staff had left, she sat in her office with the window open, letting the cool night air drift in. The building was quiet, the kind of silence that invited reflection. She thought back to her very first drive to the precinct, to the flashing lights, to the way her heart had raced as she pulled over. She thought about how that moment had tested her patience and her resolve. If she had reacted with anger that day, things might have gone differently. If she had let frustration control her, perhaps the officers would never have seen the lesson hidden in that encounter. But instead she had chosen calm, chosen dignity, and now here she was, still standing, still leading, still shaping change. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, before gathering her things to leave. As she walked through the hallway, she noticed one of the cleaning staff tidying up. She smiled warmly and exchanged a few kind words. Respect was not only for officers and administrators, it was for everyone. Every single person who made the building run. When she stepped outside, the night sky stretched above her, stars faintly visible beyond the city lights. She paused, standing by her car for a moment, letting the cool breeze brush against her face. She thought about the future, the challenges that would come, the resistance she would face, but also the possibility of transformation. She knew change was slow. It didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen in speeches alone. It happened in the quiet moments, in the choices people made when no one else was watching. And maybe, just maybe, the department had begun to take those first steps because of the lesson that had unfolded without anyone planning it. The lesson that came from stopping a woman on the road without a second thought, only to realize later she was their new administrator. That irony was no longer just a personal story. It was a symbol, a quiet reminder to everyone in the building that assumptions could blind judgment, and that respect must come first. She opened her car door, placed her briefcase on the seat, and sat for a moment before starting the engine. Her reflection in the windshield looked calm, steady, resolved. As the car pulled out of the lot and rolled onto the quiet street, she carried with her not just the weight of her role, but the hope of what it could mean for others. A future where respect was not conditional, where assumptions did not lead, where fairness guided every choice. Her journey was far from over, but she knew she was on the right path. And as the city lights flickered in the distance, she drove forward, her heart set on the promise of change. Slow, steady, but certain.